On June 25, 1876, an event that playwright Eugene O'Neill later called one of the few things in American history worth celebrating occurred on the plains of Montana Territory. The entire 7th Cavalry Unit under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer was annihilated by a coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, led by Crazy Horse and Chief Gall. This stunning defeat marked the end of a controversial military career and the beginning of an enduring American mythology that would shape the nation's understanding of its westward expansion for generations. Custer's early years. The seeds of Custer's complex character were visible from his earliest days. At the age of 4, despite a fear of blood, young George sat unflinchingly through a tooth extraction without shedding a tear. After the procedure, he turned to his father and declared, "You and I can whip all the Democrats in Ohio." This precocious display of bravado and political awareness foreshadowed the man he would become. Born into a politically active household in New Rumley, Ohio in 1839, Custer absorbed the partisan tensions of pre-Civil War America. His father, Emanuel Kuster, a blacksmith and farmer, instilled in George and his siblings a combative worldview that positioned their family against prevailing opinions. The Custer household operated with an us-against-the-world mentality that shaped George's approach to authority and institutions throughout his life. This rebellious streak found full expression during his years at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Custer accumulated an astonishing 726 demerits during his 4 years, just short of the number that would have resulted in expulsion. His graduation ranking of 34th out of 34 cadets in the class of June 1861 reflected not intellectual deficiency, but rather a disregard for regulations. Custer possessed considerable intelligence, but channeled it toward testing boundaries rather than academic excellence. What distinguished Custer from typical troublemakers was his remarkable social intelligence. Despite his abysmal class ranking, he cultivated genuine friendships across the student body. His classmates recognized his natural charisma and leadership qualities, even as officers noted his disciplinary problems. This ability to charm and inspire loyalty would serve him well in the coming conflict. Custer's Civil War career. When the Civil War erupted in April 1861, Custer's timing proved fortunate. The Union Army's desperate need for officers meant his poor academic standing was overlooked. Within weeks of graduation, Custer found himself at the First Battle of Bull Run, where he caught the attention of senior commanders through his aggressive battlefield actions. The transformation from rebellious cadet to respected officer happened with remarkable speed. Custer demonstrated genuine tactical brilliance in cavalry operations, combining aggressive offense with careful assessment of battlefield conditions. By June 1863, at the age of 23, he received a battlefield promotion to Brigadier General of Volunteers, becoming one of the youngest generals in Union history. The former class clown now commanded thousands of men in combat. Custer cultivated a distinctive martial appearance that matched his growing reputation. He adopted a flamboyant uniform featuring a velvet jacket adorned with gold braid, a red cravat, and allowed his curly blonde hair to grow long. This theatrical presentation made him instantly recognizable on the battlefield to both his men and enemy forces, earning him the nickname Boy General with the Golden Locks. At the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, Custer led crucial charges against Confederate General J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry, helping to secure the Union victory. His Michigan Cavalry Brigade suffered the highest casualties of any Union cavalry unit, but Custer's willingness to lead from the front earned him devoted followers. By war's end, he had been promoted to Major General of Volunteers and had horses shot from under him 11 times without sustaining serious injury himself. Custer played a role in the final chapter of the Civil War as well. He was present at Appomattox Courthouse when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant in April 1865. Following the ceremony, General Philip Sheridan purchased the small wooden table used for signing the surrender documents and presented it to Custer's wife, Elizabeth Libby Bacon Custer. as a token of her husband's service. This gesture recognized Custer's contributions to the Union victory and solidified his place in Civil War history. The table represented more than a mere souvenir. Libby Kuster would later become the primary architect of her husband's legacy, carefully curating his image long after his death. This gift foreshadowed her future role as the guardian of the Custer mythology, though neither she nor George could have anticipated how that mythology would be shaped by events still to come on the western frontier. Custer's brutal western campaigns. The Civil War had ended, but George Armstrong Custer's military career continued. In July 1866, he was appointed lieutenant colonel of the newly formed 7th Cavalry Regiment and dispatched to the western frontier. Here, Custer encountered a fundamentally different type of warfare against Native American tribes fighting to preserve their ancestral lands and way of life. The regular army found this guerrilla-style conflict challenging after the set-piece battles of the Civil War. Highly mobile Native warriors knew the terrain intimately and employed hit-and-run tactics that frustrated conventional military responses. The 7th Cavalry suffered early defeats and struggled to adapt to this unfamiliar combat environment. Despite these difficulties, Custer worked diligently to maintain his public image as an intrepid frontier adventurer. He cultivated relationships with journalists and wrote dramatic accounts of his exploits for Eastern newspapers. These reports often exaggerated dangers and minimized the brutality of the campaigns, presenting himself as a dashing hero taming the wilderness. The reality of these campaigns differed starkly from Custer's romanticized portrayals. While the Civil War had been fought between professional armies with established rules of engagement, the Indian Wars operated under distinctly different principles. General Philip Sheridan, Custer's superior, issued explicit orders to kill all adult male natives encountered during certain operations. Custer executed these orders with brutal efficiency during the 1868 attack on Black Kettle's Southern Cheyenne village at the Washita River in present-day Oklahoma. On November 27, 1868, Custer led the 7th Cavalry in a surprise attack on this sleeping village. The official casualty count listed 103 Native people killed, though only 11 were warriors. The remaining victims were women, children, and elderly tribe members. Additionally, Custer ordered the slaughter of approximately 875 native ponies and the burning of all village lodges and winter food supplies, leaving survivors to face starvation in the harsh winter conditions. In 1874, Custer led a 1,000-person expedition, including miners and scientists, into the Black Hills of South Dakota, territory guaranteed to the Lakota under the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. When geologists confirmed the presence of gold deposits, Custer eagerly reported this finding, triggering a gold rush that brought thousands of white settlers illegally onto Lakota land. This intrusion directly violated treaty obligations and accelerated conflicts with native tribes. In his 1874 memoir, My Life on the Plains, Custer portrayed his campaigns as noble adventures. The book described Native Americans simultaneously as formidable warriors and primitive savages, while glossing over the brutal realities of the Army's tactics. Absent from his account were the routine atrocities committed against Native populations, including sexual violence against women. Numerous soldier accounts and Native testimonies documented the widespread sexual abuse of Native women during these campaigns. In one documented instance, Custer allegedly captured an 18-year-old Cheyenne woman named Monaceta, often misspelled as Monacita, following the Washita attack and forced her to become his concubine. She served as an interpreter and sexual captive during the winter of 1868-1869. Army culture normalized such abuses, with soldiers commonly using dehumanizing language to justify sexual violence against Native women. The stark contrast between Custer's public persona and private actions extended beyond the battlefield. While he cultivated an image of devoted husband to Libby in his writings and public statements, his treatment of Native women revealed a different character. Village raids conducted by Custer's forces targeted non-combatants, destroyed essential food supplies, and resulted in widespread civilian casualties, acts entirely inconsistent with his heroic self-presentation. political ambitions and military isolation. Custer's Civil War fame and frontier exploits naturally led to political speculation. By 1874, some newspapers mentioned him as a potential presidential candidate, particularly among Democrats seeking a military hero to challenge Republican dominance. His carefully cultivated public image and familiarity with national politics positioned him as a recognizable figure who might transition from military to political leadership. However, Custer's political instincts proved remarkably poor. He repeatedly created unnecessary controversies and alienated potential allies through his combative personality and poor judgment. Rather than building coalitions, he seemed compelled to create adversaries in both military and political spheres. His most damaging political misstep occurred in 1876, when he testified before Congress about corruption in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. During his testimony, Custer explicitly accused Orville Grant, President Ulysses S. Grant's brother, of corruption in the administration of Native American trading posts. These were lucrative positions that allowed their holders to profit substantially from government contracts and trade with reservation inhabitants. President Grant, already frustrated with Custer's self-promotion and grandstanding, reacted furiously to this public attack on his family. When the 7th Cavalry was ordered to join the campaign against Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse's non-reservation Lakota and Cheyenne allies, Grant initially removed Custer from command of the expedition. Only after Custer made a personal appeal and gained the intervention of senior officers was he permitted to lead his regiment again, but the relationship remained irreparably damaged. Within the 7th Cavalry itself, Custer fostered an atmosphere of division and favoritism. He surrounded himself with loyal officers, often referred to as the Kuster Gang or Custer Ring, while isolating those he disliked. Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, both experienced officers, became particular targets of Custer's contempt. Custer publicly undermined Major Reno in newspaper interviews, questioning his competence and courage. He systematically excluded Reno from his inner circle and subjected him to public humiliation during staff meetings. Benteen, known for his independent thinking and unwillingness to flatter superiors, similarly earned Custer's antipathy. Benteen later wrote in private correspondence that Custer was a cold-blooded, untruthful, and unprincipled man, revealing the depth of animosity within the regiment's officer corps. This fractured command structure created dangerous divisions within the 7th Cavalry. Rather than functioning as a cohesive unit, the regiment operated as competing factions, with communication and cooperation severely compromised. Officers loyal to Custer received preferential assignments and recognition, while those outside his favor were marginalized and their concerns dismissed. As the regiment prepared for what would become its most famous campaign, these internal tensions remained unresolved. The absence of trust and clear communication channels between Custer and key subordinates established conditions that would prove catastrophic. When faced with the largest gathering of native warriors ever assembled on the North American plains. The disaster at Little Bighorn. By June 1876, Custer eagerly sought engagement with what intelligence reports identified as an unprecedented gathering of Lakota and Cheyenne tribes, led by spiritual leader Sitting Bull and war chiefs. Crazy Horse and Gall, between 8,000 and 10,000 native people, had congregated along the Little Bighorn River, a force that included approximately 1,500 to 2,000 warriors. This massive assembly represented the largest concentration of Plains Indians ever recorded, having formed in response to increasing military pressure and continued violations of treaty agreements. The U.S. Army's strategy involved a three-pronged attack, with columns led by General Alfred Terry, Colonel John Gibbon, and General George Crook converging on the native encampment from different directions. Custer, commanding the 7th Cavalry as part of Terry's column, was instructed to scout ahead but not engage until the full force could assemble. When Custer's scouts reported locating the village on June 25th, he made the fateful decision to attack immediately rather than wait for reinforcements. Custer's intelligence about the actual size and location of the native forces was severely limited. The hilly terrain of eastern Montana obscured the full extent of the encampment, which stretched nearly 3 miles along the riverbank. The 7th Cavalry's Crow and Arikara scouts warned Custer about the unprecedented size of the village, but these warnings went unheeded. Mitch Bowyer, Custer's mixed heritage scout, reportedly told him, "General, I have been with these Indians for 30 years, and this is the largest village I have ever seen." Despite facing a force that outnumbered his 600-man regiment by at least 3-1, Custer made the critical error of further dividing his command into 3 battalions. He assigned Major Marcus Reno to lead 1 battalion in a frontal assault on the southern end of the village, sent Captain Frederick Benteen with a 2nd battalion to scout the area to the south and west, and retained command of a 3rd battalion of 5 companies, about 210 men himself. As the battle unfolded, Custer gradually realized the true scale of the native force he faced. Accounts from Crow scouts who survived describe Custer pausing on a ridge overlooking the valley, suddenly comprehending the vast size of the encampment below. Rather than consolidating his forces at this point, Custer pressed forward toward the northern end of the village. Much of what happened next remains contested historical territory. No white soldiers from Custer's immediate command survived, leaving significant gaps in the historical record. Native accounts collected in subsequent decades provide important perspectives, but contain variations typical of oral histories compiled after significant events. Evidence suggests that as his position deteriorated, Custer attempted to implement a strategy he had used at the Washita River 8 years earlier, capturing women and children to use as human shields during retreat. Native accounts describe soldiers attempting to grab noncombatants during the battle's final phase. This tactic failed at Little Bighorn as warriors quickly isolated and surrounded Custer's battalion, cutting it off from both Reno's and Benteen's forces. Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors attacked Custer's isolated battalion from multiple directions. The fighting lasted approximately 1 hour. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield, including cartridge case distribution patterns, suggests the soldiers' defense collapsed quickly as ammunition ran low and warriors closed in. By late afternoon, Custer and approximately 210 men lay dead on what would later be called Last Stand Hill. The scale of the disaster extended beyond military defeat to personal tragedy for the Custer family. Among the dead were Custer's younger brothers Tom and Boston, his brother-in-law James Calhoun, and his nephew Harry Reed. 5 members of a single family perished together on the battlefield, highlighting the nepotistic structure Custer had created within his command. While Custer's battalion faced annihilation, Major Reno and Captain Benteen consolidated their forces on a defensive position several miles away. Despite hearing gunfire from Custer's direction, they did not attempt to come to his aid. Their inaction stemmed from multiple factors: uncertainty about Custer's precise location, the tactical difficulty of moving across exposed terrain under fire, and the lingering effects of command dysfunction. Survivors later revealed that Reno had been drinking heavily during the campaign, compromising his judgment during critical moments of the battle. His initial attack on the southern end of the village quickly collapsed into a disorganized retreat that cost nearly a third of his command. Only Captain Benteen's arrival with reinforcements prevented the complete destruction of Reno's battalion. The 2 officers established a defensive perimeter on high ground and held out against native attacks until relief forces arrived on June 27th. For officers who had served with Custer previously, his final tactical decisions appeared consistent with his established pattern of behavior: aggressive action, disregard for intelligence that contradicted his plans, and willingness to risk his command for personal glory. What differed at Little Bighorn was the unprecedented size and coordination of the native force he encountered. The birth of an American myth. News of the Custer Massacre reached the eastern United States during 4th of July celebrations marking the nation's centennial. The timing created a profound psychological impact, transforming a military defeat into a national trauma. Newspapers published extensive coverage, with headlines proclaiming "horrible massacre of troops" and "slaughter of the brave Custer." The shock of losing a celebrated Civil War hero and his entire command during the nation's 100th birthday catalyzed public opinion against native resistance. General Philip Sheridan used the defeat to secure increased military funding and authorization for an expanded campaign against non-reservation tribes. The U.S. Army deployed thousands of additional troops to the northern plains. Within 6 months of Little Bighorn, most of the victorious native coalition had been forced to surrender. By 1877, Crazy Horse was dead, and Sitting Bull had fled to Canada. The military momentum unleashed by Custer's defeat culminated in the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, where soldiers of the 7th Cavalry killed approximately 300 Lakota men, women, and children, effectively ending armed native resistance. Following Custer's death, the surviving tribes faced severe repercussions. The government confiscated the treaty-guaranteed Black Hills, established military control over remaining native territories, and accelerated the reservation system. These reservations functioned essentially as prison camps, where native people were forbidden from practicing traditional religions, speaking their languages, or leaving without permission. Food rations were used as leverage to enforce compliance with government directives. While these historical developments unfolded, Elizabeth Libby Kuster embarked on a 50-year campaign to rehabilitate her husband's reputation. Widowed at age 34, she never remarried and dedicated her life to constructing and defending the Custer legend. She published 3 influential books: Boots and Saddles, 1885, following the Guidon, 1890, and Tenting on the Plains, 1893, portraying Custer as a gallant, misunderstood hero betrayed by subordinates and government officials. Libby Kuster systematically cultivated relationships with journalists, politicians, and veterans groups. She successfully lobbied against publications critical of her husband and influenced the historical narrative around Little Bighorn. Until her death in 1933 at age 91, she maintained that Custer had been a victim of circumstances beyond his control rather than the architect of his own defeat. The mythologized Custer became a template for American heroism that extended beyond the frontier era. His image as the valiant soldier fighting against savage foes was repurposed to justify American military interventions abroad during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Political cartoons from the Spanish-American War and Philippine-American War explicitly drew parallels between frontier conflicts and overseas imperial ventures, with American soldiers depicted as continuing Custer's civilizing mission. This legacy extends to modern military terminology. The phrase Indian country entered military vocabulary during the frontier wars to designate hostile territory beyond government control. American forces continued using this term during the Vietnam War to describe Viet Cong-controlled areas, and later in Iraq and Afghanistan for insurgent strongholds. This linguistic continuity reveals the persistent influence of frontier warfare concepts on American military thinking. Little Bighorn established a narrative pattern repeated throughout subsequent American conflicts: initial overconfidence, unexpected resistance, tactical defeat, and eventual overwhelming response. This cycle appeared during the Philippine-American War, 1899 to 1902, Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, and post-9/11 conflicts. In each case, initial military setbacks generated public demands for escalation rather than reconsideration of fundamental strategy. The contrast between American and Canadian approaches to Western expansion provides an instructive counterpoint. While both nations displaced indigenous populations, Canada generally pursued a policy of negotiated treaties and police enforcement rather than military campaigns. Many historians argue that the destruction of buffalo herds and appropriation of water sources would have forced Plains tribes to surrender without the costly military confrontations championed by figures like Custer and Sheridan. The Custer myth continues to shape American cultural memory and national identity. The transformation of a military disaster into a heroic last stand reflects deeper patterns in how Americans understand their history. The actual George Armstrong Custer, impulsive, ambitious, brutal to enemies, and unreliable to allies, has been obscured by generations of myth-making that began at Little Bighorn and continues to influence American self-perception today. The story of Custer and the Little Bighorn transcends a single battle or biography. It represents a foundational narrative about America's westward expansion, revealing both the violence inherent in that process and the complex ways Americans have chosen to remember it. The gap between historical reality and cultural memory illustrates how nations construct usable pasts from complicated histories, often at the expense of uncomfortable truths.